Hi, I'm John Beck, Esri Director of Law Enforcement Solutions, and we are joined today by Dr. Spencer Chainey. Spencer is a professor at the University College London Jill Dando Institute of Security and Crime Science. Spencer has over 25 years experience researching and developing problem-oriented, intelligence-led, and evidence-based policing strategies. But beyond research, he is also actively engaged in helping police agencies around the world implement these strategies. The list of agencies and countries he has worked with is impressive and way too numerous to list here, but much of his recent work has been focused on Latin America in his role as the director of JDI's Latin American and Caribbean unit. Spencer has also authored numerous publications, including his most recent book published by Esri Press, Understanding Crime. We're going to discuss that book today. Welcome, Spencer. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, John.
So let's kick things off by discussing your new book, Understanding Crime. Can you tell us a bit about the book?
Yeah, sure. So it's a book which largely covers techniques that can be used to analyze crime. I felt that having read and even been involved in writing books that relate to GIS, crime mapping, crime analysis, that there still wasn't a book that really got into the detail in plain English terms about how to apply certain techniques to analyze the geography of crime.
The subtitle of your book is Analyzing the Geography of Crime. And I think, as you just described, spatial analysis is definitely a theme in the book. Why is geography and spatial analysis so important to the analysis and understanding of crime?
For me, right, crime has an inherent spatial and temporal component. For a crime to occur, it has to happen somewhere at some time. If you think about it, there's a lot of research and a lot of people study things about criminals. Why are people bad? And so there's a whole area of research and study about criminals. There's also a whole field of study about victimization, why certain people are victimized more, why certain targets are selected by offenders. Geography is just that other third component. It has to happen somewhere at some time. So if we don't examine the geographical aspects of crime, both the spatial and temporal aspects of crime, we're missing an opportunity really to understand crime. So that's why I personally feel that analyzing the geography of crime is a really crucial part to understanding why crime takes place, as well as it being used to help understand why certain victims or targets are selected and why offenders behave in the way that they do.
That brings me to my next question. So, hotspot analysis has been around for a long time, decades, and traditionally that means kernel density estimation, or KDE. I still think that's by far the most common way that we see crime analysts analyzing and creating hotspot maps. Why is KDE so good, and why has it been around so long?
Well, KDE is a great visual way to represent the distribution of many crime incidents. Kernel density estimation, what does it do? It shows you where the density of points and crime incidents are greatest. And you can visualize that, you can display that using a whole variety of different colors. So it's a great visual tool. It's very intuitive. You look at a KDE map and you can instantly see, or should be able to instantly see, this is where the hotspots are located. And it's a fairly straightforward and easy technique to apply. There's not too many parameters that you need to worry about to produce a good KDE map, and it's available now in the majority of GIS software, such as ArcGIS. So I think that's probably one of the main reasons why it continues to be such a great way for examining hotspots of crime.
So it sounds like it's like a good starting point to start your analysis. Is it still the best tool for analyzing crime data, or are there other tools that are better, like in different situations?
Sure. Well, I don't think there's any sort of one particular single best way or tool to examine geographic patterns of crime. KDE is great for doing one particular thing, identifying where crime concentrates, okay, and showing that visually. There are other techniques that we can use which may actually be better than KDE for looking at crime concentration. There's techniques that we talk about in the book which refer to how we can examine micro-place crime concentration. And what I mean by that is how we can identify the specific street segments and street junctions where crime highly concentrates, what we call micro-places. There's also another technique that we talk about in the book called the Gi Star Statistic, which is a kind of step beyond what KDE can do, because what the Gi Star Statistic does is it identifies hotspots, but it determines whether those hotspots are statistically significant, i.e., is what I'm seeing on my map really unusual in statistical terms. Now, those are just a few techniques that relate to hotspot analysis. There's a whole range of other techniques that we can use for examining aspects of crime. Ways in how we can examine the spatial mobility of offenders and their decision making, how we can examine patterns of crime that relate to crime risk and crime harm, and also techniques that we can use to evaluate the impact of interventions, geographic analysis that measures whether a program has been successful or not in the area that's been applied. So there's actually a whole range of different techniques which we talk about and we explain in the book.
That seems like a good segue to my next question, which is around spatial regression. So can you just start by describing what spatial regression is?
Okay, so spatial regression is a way for us to examine if the relationship between our variables of interest, and what I mean by that, let me give you an example, how crime is related to something like deprivation or social inequality or land use. What spatial regression does is it examines whether those relationships vary over space. Typical standard traditional regression isn't spatial. It would say, well, let's look at crime in relation to land use, social inequality, deprivation, and it may determine that, yes, it's related to these particular variables and in a significant way. But it assumes, though, that the relationship between crime and those variables is equal geographically. So if you think of a city, for example, where you look at crime, you look at deprivation, and you say, okay, across the city, there is this relationship. Spatial regression takes it the next step further by saying, well, does that relationship exist in all places in the city? So what we can reveal is, in certain places of a city, the relationship between crime and a variable, such as deprivation, may be highly correlated, highly related. But in other parts of the city, it may not be related. So that's what spatial regression can do.
So let's talk about another phenomenon, repeat and near repeat victimization. What is it and how does it connect to these other things that you've talked about already?
So repeat victimization and near repeat victimization are patterns. Repeat victimization is the pattern that a target, a person, a building, is victimized repeatedly a number of times, with that second, third, fourth incident tending to happen quickly after the first incident. That's basically the pattern of repeat victimization. Near repeat victimization is the pattern that places near to a place which has recently been a victim of crime are at a heightened risk of also being a victim of crime, with that pattern decaying spatially and temporally. What I mean by that is the further you move away from where the original incident takes place, the less the risk of an incident taking place. And also over time, that near repeat, both near in space and near in time, that the longer it is after that initial incident, that risk then decays over time. So these are two particular patterns that have been observed in a whole range of settings and for a whole range of different crime types, from robbery, bicycle theft, burglary, through to homicide. Okay. Now, if we observe these patterns of repeat victimization and near repeat victimization in our data, it's providing us with information which can actually help us predict crime. One of the strongest variables we have for predicting where crime is likely to happen in the future is where crime has happened recently. So if we see that we have a strong pattern, a strong presence of repeat victimization, we can then organize interventions that say, when we identify an incident that's taken place and we are fearful of repeats taking place, we can organize an intervention that kind of circumvents that. And the same with near repeats. If we see an area where we have incidents and we are fearful of further near repeats taking place, we can then put in a program to counter those near repeats from taking place. So that's how those patterns can work. We can analyze those patterns. There's a whole chapter in the book that talks about how we can analyze these patterns, and we can use them in very practical ways to prevent crime from happening.
Can you talk a little bit about how do agencies operationalize this type of analysis and use it for decision making?
Well, I think the best way for me to describe it is to give you some examples rather than just thinking sort of like hypothetically about a few things. So, as you mentioned, I've been working quite a lot in recent years with police agencies in Latin America. In Uruguay, in 2016, they introduced a new large-scale hotspot policing program across the city of Montevideo. To introduce that hotspot policing program, they did the analysis. They had to do analysis of where the hotspots were located. So what they did is they started by saying, right, well, let's use some of these techniques that we've heard Spencer talk about and others talk about. Let's examine the particular micro places, the street segments where crimes concentrate. And that's what they did. They identified where the police should be deployed to. They use that information as well to determine exactly how many police officers would be required to effectively police the city in the hotspots, and they implemented a program, and that program still runs today in Montevideo. In other places, they use different techniques. So I worked a few years ago in Manchester, where in Manchester they were examining patterns of burglary, and they identified that there was a high level of repeat victimization and near repeat victimization. They did the analysis, they followed the guidance of me and others about how you do that analysis, and then based on those results, they then introduced a program to counter those repeats and near repeats taking place. They introduced a program that effectively responded to incidents of burglary as and when they happened, and tried to, what we call kind of cocoon things, further events happening on that street, by making visits to the nearby neighbors and making them aware of a recent burglary, and just making sure that they were being extra vigilant over the next week or so about any suspicious behavior. Those are a couple of examples. I mean, there are many, many examples I talk about and refer to in the book that illustrate the sort of techniques that are incorporated and that we describe in the book.
Since you're only one person and not every agency can bring you in to stand up an analytical program and operationalize it, do you have any advice for an agency that wants to get started with some of the analytical methods you describe in the book?
I always think the first thing that an agency needs to do is be clear about what it is they want. What are their objectives? So I typically find that there tends to be kind of three types of analytical roles or analysis that police agencies want to do. One is performance analysis. The second is crime pattern analysis, identifying crime problems. And the third is analysis to support investigations. So I think it's for the agency, first of all, to decide, well, are we going to do all three of those, or are we going to focus on one area in particular? If an agency is starting out, I recommend they only chose one of those. And for them, it's based on whatever their particular priorities are. My preference would be to focus on the second of those. Focus on your crime problems. Let's start to address some of our crime problems, because then we can expand out from there. Then to kind of start something, I always think a great way to start is to start on an actual project. Don't start by coming up with, right, we're going to do a whole range of different things and list all these kind of intentions of what you plan to do. Focus on a particular project. Focus on a particular priority. And what I mean by that is, what is the big key priority in terms of addressing crime in your city, in your district? Then work on a project around that, thinking about, right, how can we use geographical analysis in some way to better understand this particular crime problem? So we can develop analysis, capacity and capability based around this project, so that when we implement an intervention, we already are seeing some good early wins from the investment in analysis.
Thanks for joining us today. The book is Understanding Crime, Analyzing the Geography of Crime. As Spencer just mentioned, there's much more that we didn't get to today, so check out the book. Thank you, Spencer,
My pleasure.
and thanks for joining us.